Hello, fellow book readers. My name is John, and today I want to talk about my last week of December and all of January reads. I read a lot of books in January and the last week of December. I read 15 books, which for me would be a lot for 1 month. Uh, so I just want to talk a little bit about each one of them. Not like full in-depth reviews, but just like tiny little reviews and talk about if I like them or not. And I'll give you my star rating at the end of each uh, book. But before I do that, let's talk a little bit about my star ratings and what they mean. Because everybody star rates a little bit differently, and I want to talk about what the star ratings for me mean. That way you will know in case you want to check out one of the books. So for me, 5 stars is a perfect book. It just means it's perfect. That's what it means. To me, it's perfect. It doesn't mean it's objectively perfect, but for me, I found it to be a perfect book. Okay? So 4.5 is a great book that I enjoyed as much as the perfect books. So I still enjoyed this the same as I enjoyed a book that I considered perfect, but I can see some flaws in it that knocks it down half a star. But it's still a great book. 4 stars, it's a great book. It's not perfect, but it's great. I really enjoyed it. 3.5 stars is a good book that I enjoyed as much as I enjoyed my great books. So yeah, I see some more flaws in this. I can't quite say it's a great book, but I enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed any book that I gave 4 stars. It's a good book. 3 stars is just a good book. So yeah, there you go. It's not great, it's not perfect, but it's still good, and I'm not like mad I read it. I enjoyed myself. I enjoyed my time reading it. Okay, so now we get into the 2.5 and 2 star range. And these books are either they fall in one of two categories. They're either a fine book, they're not good, but they're just fine, or they're a good book, but they're not for me. Like I didn't enjoy myself. They weren't for me. I can still say it's a good book. I can still see that it's a good book. Other people would enjoy it and call it good, but for me, it just wasn't for me. It didn't hit right. So those are the 2 and 2.5, and you can work out on your own what it would mean if they were 2 or 2.5. Maybe it's just a little bit closer to good, but it's not quite there yet, or it is a fine book that's just not for me. Okay, so then 1 star, there's no 1.5. 1 star means I absolutely hated my time reading it. Yeah, I just did not enjoy my time reading it at all. So there you go. Hated my time reading it. And then if it's under 1 star, I didn't finish it. It's just a book I didn't finish. I hated it so much that I didn't finish it. If I finish a book, I'll never give it under 1 star. It'll always be like if I hated it or think it's bad, 1 star. So now that we got that out of the way, let's talk about the 15 books. I'm going to talk about them in chronological order, like how I read them each during this month and a week period. Um, yeah, and there will be tiny spoilers, not too much, but just a little bit of spoilers for each book. So the first book I read, and I read it like the last week of December, would be Shadow and Bone by Leigh Bardugo. I thought this was a fun book. It's a really interesting Russian-inspired world building, and there's a lot of great magic in it. I really enjoyed the magic. I think the magic is actually the highlight of the book. I think the villain, the Darkling, he's a good villain, really good villain, especially in this book. As we get later with him, we'll talk a little bit more. Alina, who is the main character, the entire story is in her point of view. I think she's a little bit one-dimensional as a character, but it doesn't detract from the book too much. I think it really actually helps her. It doesn't help her, but it doesn't detract from her hero's journey in this book. Like, I think the journey still works. The dimension that she brings is still like pure. Like she's a good hero. Like I said, this book is really like a hero's journey done right. I think. It's not too complex though, but it is done right, and I think the story really works. I did feel like if there was one con that keeps it from getting into the 4.5 to 5 star range for me, it would be that the love triangle that they introduced in this book, it really wasn't needed. Like I never once bought that the Darkling was not terrible. Like I knew he was bad the entire time, so I didn't buy the love triangle at all. But everything else about this book I really enjoyed, and I think it's a great book. I gave it 4 stars. Okay, and this other book I also read the last week of December. It is the second book in the Shadow and Bone trilogy, Siege and Storm. This book suffers from middle book syndrome. I still think it's a good book, but it's not. It doesn't even come close to like hitting the great book tier. A couple things wrong with it. It's a bit disjointed and it's a little slow. The main characters, again, the three main characters are Alina, who is still one dimensional in this book, and actually, I think some of the choices she makes in this book a little bit out of character. Then there's the Darkling, who's still a good villain in this book, but he's not around as much. And then there's Mal, who is Alina's like love interest. Mal's very boring. He's just a boring character, and he doesn't get any better in this book, really. So that's a bit of a problem. I don't hate Mal. Some people hate Mal. I don't hate Mal. Mal's fine, but he doesn't elevate the book at all, is what I'm trying to say. Now, what this book does great is it introduces a lot of good side characters. So you get Nikolai, who is the youngest prince of Ravka, which is the main country the story takes place in. Like I said, it's a Russian-inspired world building, and he's awesome. He's probably my second favorite. I think he's actually my favorite character in the series. Then you get his twins. I forget their name, but there's two twins that are like his bodyguards, and they're like hidden Grisha. Like these are Grisha who did not go to the little palace to be trained, so they're in hiding, but they're with the prince Nikolai, and they're awesome. They're funny. They're charismatic. They have a certain like wit about them that's just really good, and I quite enjoy their characters. Okay, then this book brings back some other characters like Zoya. Zoya was in the first book, but she was kind of an ass in the first book. She's still an ass in this one, but she's like more sympathetic. She's awesome in this book. Awesome, awesome character. And she gets a lot better as the series goes on too. So yeah, she's great in this book. And then you have Genya, who's not in this book as much as she is in the first book, but her story is so good. I love Genya. And she's great in this book as well. So this book really shines on the side characters, while the main characters are kind of not as fun to read, which is odd. I don't find that super often in books, that the side characters can carry the story like they do in this one. Like I said, this book has some other problems. There's a love triangle again, and it's like, did we need a second love triangle? And it's like, okay, we already know she likes Mal. Like she's gonna pick Mal, so we didn't need another love triangle. And then there's like these weird dream sequences where Alina like feels feelings for the Darkling again. And it's like, no, we established at the end of last book, the Darkling is not good. There's nothing good about him. He is straight up evil. Like, what are we doing? What are we doing? But like I said, this book isn't bad. It's not great though. I would say it's even better than fine. I gave it 3 stars. It's still a good book, but it's just a good book. It doesn't threaten to get into the great category at all. It stays in the good book territory. So it's 3 stars for me. So I gave this book. And then I finished off with Runen Rising, which I finished on New Year's Day, which is the 3rd and final book in the Shadow and Bone trilogy. This one, to me, it delivers a good end. Like, the end of this book is really good, in my opinion. I like the conclusion. I have one small problem. I don't understand the reason why Alina lost her powers. I have no problem with Alina losing her powers. I actually think that works. I just don't think the reason that she gives for losing her powers matches what happens in the plot. So I think the book could have used a little bit more editing to make it more clear why she lost her powers. That being said, I think all the characters deliver in this book. The Darkling, even the main characters are good in this book. Again, Mal's a little bit boring, but Alina's better in this book. The Darkling's better in this book. All the side characters are awesome in this book. This book doesn't quite hit the great tier of the first book. I still think Shadow and Bone is the highest rated of this trilogy, but this one threatens to get up that high. I'm going to give it 3.5 stars. Okay, and then we continued our Grishaverse journey into the new year. I finished the entire Grishaverse in this 5-week period. So next up was 6 of Crows, which I actually own the physical copy of. The other 3 I just read on my Kindle because they were all on Kindle Unlimited. 6 Crows right here. Again, this is by Leigh Bardugo. This one's awesome. This would be... I have this also... I gave this book 4 stars. Great book. I think the beginning, as you get into it, because again, it's a heist story and it introduces 6 characters who they call the 6 of Crows, right? And there's 6 different point of views, so it's not all on one point of view like the Shadow and Bone trilogy. So you have to get to know these 6 characters, and it does take a while. So the first 100 or so pages, maybe 150 pages, are a little slow and a little bit of a slog to get through. But once you get through that, the book is great the entire way through. The heist is interesting. Obviously, it's not just like simple. The stakes are high. My favorite of the crows would be Nina. She is also a Grisha. She's the only Grisha on the crew. Well, I won't say it. She's the only Grisha on the crew. And yeah, I like the story a lot. And then the end to set up the next book is great. Like, it ends in a way that sets up the next book, and it's awesome. This book delivers. People love this series. It's set in a different place. It's set in the same world as Shadow and Bone, but in a different place, a different country. So you don't see any of the Shadow and Bone characters in this book. But let's talk about The Kingdom, which I read next, which is the next and final book in this duology. This book rules. It is my second favorite book of the month that I've read. I give this 4.5 stars. It's a great book that threatens to get into the perfect tier. There's only one thing that keeps out of the perfect tier, in my opinion, and I will talk about that in a minute. Since you already know the six crows, the story is able to pick up very fast. So there's no, like, the first 100 pages are not slow or a slog to get through. It's awesome. The heist is even better than the heist in the first book because the stakes are way higher. The series connects back to the Shadow and Bone trilogy, so you get like more Shadow and Bone characters into this book, which is really cool because they're all the characters that I loved in Shadow and Bone show up here, which is awesome. But I think the pacing is wonderful. It's a long book too. It's a very long book, very thick. Again, it's also by Leigh Bardugo. But the pacing works really well, or it doesn't feel long. I think I read this book in 3 days, so yeah, it didn't take me very long at all. So the only thing that kept it from getting 5 stars for me is they kill one of the crows at the end of the book, and I don't think that was needed. Like, I hated that. He kind of dies randomly. He doesn't really, like, the story's over and then he dies, basically. It's heartbreaking, really, and I understand why she did it because it sets up the next duology that she eventually writes. But I didn't like it. I didn't love that choice. That's just personal. Like, it doesn't. Other people may love it, but personally, I did not love it. So for me, that knocked it down 0.5 star. I gave it 4.5 stars. Still a great book though, and I would recommend this duology to anybody. Anybody. Shadow and Bone, I would also recommend, but understand that it's a bit of an uneven trilogy. Where this duology, both books rule. They're both great. Okay, so then I finished off the Grishaverse, the mainline Grishaverse. I didn't read I think there's 2 companion novels. I didn't read those. Novellas, I should say. But I finished off the Grishaverse. Next, I read King of Scars, which is also by Leigh Bardugo, obviously. And this duology follows the events of the Shadow and Bone trilogy years later. I think it's 5 years later, but it might be 4 years later. I don't remember exactly, but it's years into the future, and it follows Nikolai, who is now the king of Ravka, trying to make this country peaceful again, like rebuild the country that the Darkling basically destroyed. He also has his past coming back up to haunt him because of the events of things that happened to him in Shadow and Bone. Those are going to come back up and haunt him a little bit. So he has to deal with that. So he's not the only point of view character, though. You also get Zoya. Remember Zoya? I talked about her when I talked about the Shadow and Bone trilogy. She is like one of the Grisha triumvirate, which are like, there's 3 Grisha now, and the Darkling used to be in charge of the second army, which is the Grisha army. Now there's 3 leaders of the Grisha army, and she's one of them. So she's a point of view character here too. And her story, in my opinion, is the best of the 3 point of view characters in both books, really, but especially in this one. And then you got the 3rd point of view character, which is Nina, who was in the Six of Crows duology. She was my favorite, so I really love that she was back in this book. And her story is really interesting because it takes place in a different country than Ravka, but she's working with Ravka in this other country, and they all sort of connect in the second book. So the only reason this book isn't a great book for me, like it doesn't get 4 stars, is because it's a bit of a setup book. Like, honestly, not a lot happens in this book. The stuff that does happen is really good, but it's all just setting up the second book. Don't get me wrong, the character work is perfect. I would give the character work 5 stars in this book, but the plot itself is probably a 3-star plot. So for me, it equaled a 3.5 star. Good, threatening, great, but it never gets to the great category. But I say that to say that the next book, Rule of Wolves, which is the final book in the Grishaverse for now, is a 4-star book. I thought this book ruled. Awesome book, awesome conclusion to the Grishaverse. I really hope actually she doesn't like continue any more books in this, because I think the way this book ends is perfect. Like, this is a great way to end the series. Everybody's where they should be, I feel like. It's a coming of age story, really, even though the characters are already of age, but they come of age and become like where they should be in life in this story. So my only problem with actually both of these books, plot-wise, is they bring back the Darkling, and that sort of, in my opinion, ruins the end of Shadow and Bone trilogy. And I think the way the Shadow and Bone trilogy wraps up is really nice. And the thing is, they didn't even have to bring the Darkling back, because they could have done this plot for these 2 books, King of Stars and Rule of Wolves, basically the same without the Darkling. Like, he did not need to come back. So I don't understand why she chose to do that, but she did, and it doesn't like detract from the book so much, in my opinion, that it makes it not great. Because, like I said, this book is still amazing. It's still great. You can basically ignore the Darkling, and the book is still the same. Like I said, great book. I highly recommend this duology to everybody. The thing is, though, you have to read the Shadow and Bone trilogy before you read it. You can skip the Six of Crows duology, and you really won't be that lost. A little bit with Nina, but not too bad. You can sort of pick up on what she's going through. I do recommend this duology, for sure. Okay, so next up I read How the King of ElfHame Learned to Hate Stories, which is a companion novella for the Cruel Prince trilogy, which I read last year. In terms of companion novellas, this is one of the best I've ever read. It's not long, very, very short, and it has some really good art in it. But the story itself is awesome, because in my opinion, the weakest book in the Cruel Prince trilogy is the first book, which is The Cruel Prince, because Cardan is not likable at all in that book. He's just not. Towards the end, he gets a little bit better, but what he does in the beginning, it's just very, very unlikable stuff. And this book right here is basically entirely in Cardan's point of view, and they're on a new adventure, so it's post Queen of Nothing, which is the last book in the trilogy. But he's thinking about stuff that happened in the Cruel Prince, and you see like his point of view on stuff before the Cruel Prince happened and like during the Cruel Prince. So you see his point of view, and you get to read like, oh, okay, maybe he's not as bad as I thought. Right? And I actually think it improves the first book a lot. Like, I wish I read this before I read the first book. Or, like, directly after the first book, actually. I wouldn't want to read it before the first book. But directly after the first book, I wish I read this book. Because I think it makes the first book a lot better. So, yeah. For that reason, I gave it 3.5 stars. It's a quick read, too. You can read it in a day. I think I read it in a day. It might have been 2, but very, very quick. Okay, so next up is The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by V.E. Swab. Now, have you ever read a book where the ending kills a story for you? Because that was my experience with this book. This book was flying high. It was going to get 4 stars for me. It was a great book. I was enjoying it. I was flying through it. And then the end happened, and I hated it. I hated the end with a passion. I so didn't want what happened to happen. Like, it was, look, I get it. Bittersweet stuff is good, but this wasn't bittersweet. This book, the end of this book is just bitter, in my opinion. And for me, it killed the story. Like, I ended up giving this book 2 stars. It's good, but it's not for me. That's how I would put it. I did not enjoy the end of this book, which is sad because I really like the story it told. Okay, so next up would be To Kill a Kingdom by Alexandra Christo. This is a dark retelling of The Little Mermaid with sirens instead of mermaids, basically. This book's good. It doesn't try to be anything more than it is. It's not trying to be a great book, in my opinion. It's not trying to be a perfect book. It's just trying to be a good book, tell a dark retelling of this fairy tale. And it does it. It does that job really well. I think the end of the book, the action scene at the end is like really good. The characters are not super memorable, so there's that. I don't know if I'd recommend this book to others. I do think it's a good book. Like I said, I gave it 3 stars, and it's a quick read. So for that reason, I probably would. If it was longer, I would not recommend it to other people. But since it's kind of short, if you like The Little Mermaid, I would recommend reading this book. It's an interesting take on it. Okay, next up would be my one and only nonfiction book of the month. Try to do one nonfiction book a month. That would be StuGotz's personal record book by John StuGotz Wiener and Dan Stanzik. Yeah, so this is just a sports book. It's like yeah, if you ever seen First Take, you know how people like give different like hot takes on different sporting events. That's this book basically. This is just Stu Gotts given his different crazy takes on different sporting events, and trust me, they're crazy. If you ever watched the Dan Le Batard show, which is a sports radio show, that used to be on ESPN. It's not on ESPN anymore. I don't know exactly where it's available on now. But yeah, StuGotz is the co-host of that show, and he's StuGotz. He's kind of crazy, and this book is awesome because it's like StuGotz will give his opinion, and then he'll give somebody else. He'll bring on somebody else to write like a rebuttal, and that person will just trash StuGotz. It's hilarious. So if you're looking for a non-serious sports book, that would be this one. It has a lot of wit and a lot of humor, and I enjoyed it a lot. I don't really like to rate nonfiction books because they're not really trying to tell a story. But if I were to rate it, I would say it's a good book. I would give it 3.5 stars. I enjoyed it a lot. And it's short, so there's that. Okay, next up would be my number one book of the month. That would be Onyx Storm by Rebecca Yarros, which is the third book in the Tyrion series. I thought this book delivered. There was a lot of hype going on in this book, and this book sold like crazy. I think it's like the third best adult fiction seller in the past 25 years or something like that. So yeah, this book sold like crazy, and I think it lived up to the hype. This book is more like an epic fantasy than the prior 2 books, which were the first book is this is how I describe the series. The first book is like adult Harry Potter, right? And then the second book is adult Harry Potter meets White Walkers. So the first half of the book is adult Harry Potter, then the second half is White Walkers. This book's just all White Walkers. It's just straight up epic fantasy. The school's still there, but not really. Like they're off on a quest doing other stuff. And yeah, the twists and turns in this book are really fun and really interesting and really, I think, good. I gave Fourth Wing and Iron Flame both 4 stars. This is my favorite book of the trilogy. I gave it 4.5 stars. It's a near perfect book. I can't quite give it a perfect book grade, but it threatened to get a perfect book grade. And the end, the end. Whew. I don't know how I'm gonna wait. Presumably 2 years for the next book, but I can't wait for it. Okay, and then next up would be The Winter King by Bernard Cornwell. This is his dark historical fantasy take on King Arthur. So I really like this trilogy. The first book, though, very slow. It's a very slow book, and the prose is a bit meandering. And I don't say that negatively, because prose like that can actually work really well, but I have to be into the story first before I like that. That type of prose isn't going to get me into a story. I have to get into the story and then have that type of prose. Wasn't in the story yet, and he's already throwing that type of prose at me, and it just didn't work for me that well. Once I got to know the characters and once I got to see where the story was going, I really enjoyed it. So the second half is very good, but the first half of the story is I hated my time reading it. The first half I was struggling. Like I didn't know if I would finish the trilogy based on the first half. I thought, okay, I'll finish this book, but I'm not going to read the next 2. And then I got to the second half, and it quickly changed my mind. So yeah, that's my opinion on The Winter King. I gave it 2.5 stars because, like I said, the second half of the book is amazing, but the first half really bad in my opinion. Really bad for me. I shouldn't say it's not. It's objectively a good book, but it was. I struggled a lot to get through it. I actively hated my time reading the first half. But then we get to the sequel, Enemy of God, which is again also by Bernard Cornwell. This is where the series gets amazing. Like, this one is action packed. Cornwell writes action better than almost any author I've ever read. His action scenes are very detailed, very good. The character work here is superb. The twists and turns are fascinating. I love his take on Merlin and Guinevere and Lancelot and Arthur. They're like my 4 favorite takes on those 4 characters that I've ever read, and I like the King Arthur mythology a lot. Like, big fan of just the King Arthur story. But I loved his take on those 4 characters. Lancelot is a real bastard. My favorite character that he talks about, though, in this series is Senwyn. She's awesome. Her and Gerfrel are just amazing. And yeah, I really like this book a lot. I gave it 3.5 stars. It's not quite great because I think it's a little bit long, just a little too long. I think we could have cut about 50 pages out and it would have easily been 4.5 star range. But still a very good book, and I would recommend it to anybody. Next book would be, and the final book in the trilogy, and the final book I read this month would be Excalibur, which is the third and final book in this King Arthur trilogy that Cornwell wrote. I think the name of the trilogy is the Warlord Chronicles. I love the way this book ends. It ends sort of on a pick your own destiny type path. We don't know if Arthur is still alive at the end of the book or not. I like to think he's still alive, but he might not be. It depends on how you read it, really. The end, like I said, it's a bittersweet ending, but it works for the tone that this story is. Like I said, this story is a very dark take on King Arthur, and the end delivers. The end delivers the tone he was going for. This book is, again, another action-packed book. The highlight of this book is probably Nimue. I don't know if I'm saying her name right. I never learned how to say her name. But yeah, she's like Merlin's assistant, basically, and she's on a vengeance. She wants the old gods back, and she's doing anything she can to bring the old gods back, including some pretty horrible things. But yeah, this book really, really works in my opinion, and again, I think this is just as good as Enemy of God. I'm giving it 3.5 stars. So the last 2 books in this, again, this book would probably be about 25 pages shorter, which is what's keeping it from getting into the 4-star range. But 3.5 stars. I enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed any great book I read this month, and I would recommend this trilogy to anybody. Again, you're gonna have to suffer through the first half of The Winter King, in my opinion, but once you get past that, the series is very, very, very good. So that was my month of reading. It was a very fun month. Most of the books I read were pretty short or not super long. I didn't really read any super long books this month. I think the longest book I read was Crooked Kingdom. I would say Crooked Kingdom is a pretty long book. But other than that, all the books I read were either like just the right amount of size or very short. So, that being said, I look forward to a good month of reading in February. I think the next video I make next week will be what books I'm reading in February. Like, what books do I plan on reading this month? And there's a lot of good ones, I think. So I can't wait to make that video. That being said, thank you for stopping by, and have a good month of reading.